It is late in a large North American city. Seen from several blocks away, the windows stop looking like rooms and become a pattern of light. One of them belongs to a person who is still awake, holding a phone close enough to tint their face blue. Traffic continues below. A train crosses a bridge with only a few people inside. In one apartment, a kettle clicks off. In another, someone eases a door shut and hopes the hinge will not wake the house. A result or a message has just arrived. Nothing loud has happened, but the evening has divided into before and after. The body reaches for company before the mind has decided what to say. They open the contact list. There are hundreds of names in it. Old classmates, former co-workers, relatives in other time zones, people last seen at weddings or in cities they no longer live in. Some still feel familiar. Others are little more than a face and a history of messages. One contact is saved twice, once under a surname and once under an old workplace. Another has no surname at all. A few names bring back whole rooms for a second, then vanish into the list. The thumb moves down, back up, then stops. No one has taken the phone away. There are people to call. The difficulty is knowing which relationship can hold what just happened. A lot of people have had a version of this night. The details change. A kitchen, a parked car, a bathroom with the tap running. But the hesitation is recognizable. A person can be surrounded by possible contact and still have nowhere obvious to place one difficult hour. Sometimes the call is eventually made and begins badly. Too much explanation, an apology for the time, the other person needing a moment to understand. It can still be the right call. The technology is extraordinary. More than 8 billion people live across cities, towns, coastlines and plains, linked by cables and signals that would have looked like magic to almost everyone who came before. A voice can cross an ocean almost instantly, and a face can appear from another continent before the kettle boils. The old ache has not disappeared with distance. It is not present in every life or every evening, but it turns up often enough to feel ordinary across very different lives. We tend to treat that ache as a private failure, a sign that we did something wrong, that we didn't try hard enough, that something in us is broken or hard to love. There is another way to read it. Loneliness may not be evidence that a person failed at being lovable. It may be an old signal built for a life in which losing contact with other people carried practical danger, a warning that something the species once relied on had gone quiet. That signal makes more sense in an older setting before the towers and trains, when being cut off could mean facing hunger, injury, weather, or a predator without help. The evidence will never make a perfectly continuous story. Too much of human life left no written record, and no single theory explains the feeling on its own. There is still enough to ask a useful question. What did belonging consist of before people had a private word for its absence, and what changed around it? For now, leave the city outside the window. In the older world, being cut off carried consequences a phone call could not solve. Loneliness is usually described as an emotion, but the body does not treat it as something purely mental. It can settle in the chest or throat, or make the end of an otherwise ordinary day feel physically heavier. We use the language of injury for it, hollow, aching. And that turn of phrase may be more literal than it first sounds. Researchers who study social pain have found that the discomfort of being excluded and the discomfort of physical hurt seem to draw on some of the same circuitry in the brain, not identical circuitry, and the science here is still debated. But there appears to be some overlap, as if the body files certain kinds of social loss under a heading it already uses for pain. So why would being left out feel like being hurt at all? The word itself covers several experiences that need separating, because being alone and feeling lonely are not the same condition. There's loneliness itself, the gap between the connection we want and the connection we have. It's a feeling, and it's subjective. That gap can open even when a life looks, from the outside, entirely full. Then there's social isolation, which is different, the more objective side. How many people are actually around you, how large your network is, how often you make contact. A person can be isolated without feeling lonely. A person can feel lonely without being isolated at all. The two track each other only loosely. Plenty of people with wide networks report real loneliness, and plenty of people with small, quiet lives report none at all. And then there's solitude, being alone on purpose. For a lot of people, most of the time, that's not a problem to be solved. It's where thinking happens, where rest happens, sometimes where the best work gets done. The 20 quiet minutes with coffee before the house wakes up, the weekend alone that a person actually looked forward to. It tends to shift towards something closer to loneliness only once it stops being a choice. Even loneliness itself comes in layers. There's the ache for one close trusted person to say the unedited truth to. There's a wider ache for a circle of friends, a group to move through the world with. And there's a broader one still, the wish to belong to something larger than yourself, a people, a cause, a shared identity. You can have one of these and still feel the absence of another. These distinctions matter because the feeling here is more specific than simply having too few people nearby. A crowded life can contain it, while a quiet life may not. There's a way of understanding loneliness that treats it less like a malfunction and more like an alarm. The discomfort in this view has a job. It's unpleasant on purpose, the way hunger and thirst are unpleasant on purpose. Hunger moves us toward food. Thirst moves us toward water. Loneliness, in this account, moves us back toward other people. For most of the human story, that instruction carried real stakes. To be cut off from the group wasn't just an emotional strain. It could mean facing predators, hunger, injury and weather without the people who made survival possible, leaving a person in far greater danger. The discomfort may have helped pull a person back, to shelter, to the others, before the distance became dangerous, for a short spell of loneliness that still works more or less as designed. We feel the pull, we reach out, we reconnect, and the feeling eases. The alarm did its job and went quiet. Something goes wrong, though, when the feeling doesn't ease, when loneliness turns chronic, stretching on for months, for years. The same alarm that was meant to draw us toward people can start pushing us away from them. A brain on long-term alert becomes watchful. It starts scanning for rejection, for signs that others might exclude or hurt it. Small slights land harder. Neutral faces read as colder than they are. Without meaning to, a lonely person can grow more guarded, more likely to expect the worst from an encounter, more likely to withdraw before anyone else can. It's one of the quiet cruelties of the whole system. The state that most needs connection can end up making connection harder to reach. The alarm keeps ringing. It just stops pointing home. Even the English word carries a history. In the heavy inward sense we now give it, loneliness is not especially old. Some historians of emotion trace that shift to around the early 19th century. Earlier uses more often described being alone in a place, without quite the same burden of private suffering. That doesn't mean people before then felt nothing of the kind. Of course they did. Longing, exile, grief, the pain of being cast out, those are as old as we are, in every century and every culture that left a record of itself. What may have shifted is less the feeling itself than the frame placed around it. The sense that this ache belongs to a private individual self, rather than to a fate, a punishment, or a condition shared with everyone around you. That history matters because it suggests loneliness is not only a biological signal, Its meaning is also shaped by the kind of self the surrounding world asks a person to be. The alarm itself cannot answer the harder question, whether the world around it still offers a way home that a person can recognize. Human beings were woven into one another long before loneliness became private language. The dependence begins at birth, with the most helpless member of the group. Start with a human infant, only a few hours old. It cannot fend for itself, and for years it will not come close. The thought of leaving it alone is unbearable, because the dependency is so complete. The thought is almost unbearable, and that's the point. Compared with many other mammals, human babies are extraordinarily helpless. They can't walk, cling, feed themselves, or flee from anything, and they remain dependent for years. A foal stands within an hour of being born. A human takes a year just to walk, and far longer before it can survive without steady care. That long, slow childhood is one of the defining facts of our species, and it points to something about the adults around that child too. Human children appear to have evolved inside social arrangements, where the work of raising them was rarely carried by one person alone. Across many societies that load has been shared, by fathers, but also by grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, cousins, and adults with no blood tie at all. Anthropologists have a term for this pattern, cooperative breeding, meaning that others beyond the parents routinely help carry the cost of raising the young. Researchers sometimes call these additional caregivers alloparents, a word that simply means parents in effect, though not by blood. How that support was arranged has never been uniform. In some societies it is centred on the mother's own mother. In others, on a wider network of classificatory aunts and uncles who share no genetic tie at all. In others still, on older children or age mates who take on much of the daily supervision of the very young. Some societies leaned heavily on grandmothers, others relied on networks of older children minding younger ones, or on a wider community treating a child's welfare as shared business. Single parents have always existed too, in every era, often managing something genuinely difficult without much of a safety net, and that difficulty is itself a clue to how much backup human child rearing seems built to expect, not proof that anything is wrong with a family that doesn't have it. Notice, though, what this tells us about adults in general. A human life from its very first hours was rarely carried by just one pair of hands, and childcare was only one thread in a much larger weave. Think about what a single person actually needs to survive in a world without shops, hospitals, or stored abundance. Food has to be found, and finding it takes knowledge no one person can hold in full. Which plants heal and which ones kill, where the water sits in a dry season, how to read the movement of animals, when the rains come, where a particular tree fruits and in which month. That kind of knowledge is too vast for any single mind. It lived across many minds and many lifetimes, gathered slowly, corrected, added to. A child didn't read it from a page. They absorbed it by watching, by being corrected mid-task, by hearing the same lesson told a slightly different way by 3 different elders over the course of a year. An older person, who could no longer hunt or gather, might still hold the memory of a drought decades back, and how people had gotten through it. That memory wasn't sentimental, it was practical equipment. So the group functioned as something like a library, a pantry, a hospital, and a school, all at once. Food knowledge held collectively, medicine held in the hands of those who knew which leaves to use, a kind of insurance against the season when your own luck ran out and someone else's held. Older accounts often placed a lone male hunter at the centre of this story, striding out to bring home meat. that picture is incomplete and, in many settings, inaccurate. In a great many societies, much of the reliable daily food came from gathering, work often done by women. It was steady, skilled, essential, and its quieter forms mattered as much as the dramatic ones. Love was only one thread binding a person to the group. People also occupied recognizable places in its daily work, and those places were visible in ordinary routines. Consider the ordinary ways a single human being could matter to the people around them. Someone carried the wood so the fire never went out. Someone watched the children while others worked. Someone knew where a certain spring was, or recognized a plant that eased fever, or sat with the sick through the night, or remembered a story no one else could tell, or noticed when a person failed to come home and went out looking. The acts themselves were modest: carrying wood, watching a child, remembering where water could be found, sitting beside the sick. Together they meant that a person's presence altered somebody else's day. If they disappeared, a task, a memory, or a form of care had to be picked up by somebody else. This is a quieter kind of belonging than the one we usually talk about. We tend to focus on being loved, being liked, being wanted. There's a second thing underneath it, easy to overlook: having a place in the working life of a group. That should not be confused with usefulness in the sense of output, productivity, or earning one's keep. A person too sick to rise from bed, an infant, someone deep in old age. None of them were carrying wood or minding a fire, and none of them mattered less for it. What we're describing is smaller and more universal than productivity. Researchers sometimes call it mattering, the sense that a person's presence gets registered, that their absence would be noticed, and that some part of their existence, their care, memory, or simple regular presence, occupies real space in somebody else's life. In a small, interdependent group, evidence of that place could be woven into the day without anyone naming it. Someone expected you at a particular time. Someone asked where you'd gone if you didn't appear. Recognition arrived through repeated, ordinary contact. Modern life can look very different. It's possible now to go through an entire week surrounded by people, cared about by several of them, and still experience very few moments of direct mutual dependence. The kind where someone is relying on you specifically, today, for something real. That's not a moral failing in anyone. It's closer to a structural fact about how differently we now live. We often ask ourselves whether we're loved. It may be a quieter, harder question that lingers underneath. Does my presence take up any space in someone else's day? The point is not that a person has to be indispensable. Human worth was never only a matter of being needed, and people throughout history have been cared for tenderly without producing or providing anything at all. But something does seem to have thinned out: the ordinary daily evidence that we occupy a place in one another's lives. That thinning may be part of what we're calling loneliness, even when we can't quite name what's missing. To feel the full weight of belonging, though, it helps to look at its opposite. Not solitude, which can be chosen and good, but the deliberate removal of a person from the group. What happened in the human world when belonging was taken away on purpose? Across different societies, exclusion has taken many forms. Some cultures wrote banishment into law, casting a person out of a city or a homeland by formal decree. Others relied on something quieter, an unspoken agreement sustained by an entire community, to act as though a person simply wasn't there. The quieter form can be especially thorough. No one meets the person's eyes. When they enter a room, the conversation does not pause for them, and it does not include them either. When they speak, no one answers. They still have a body and take up space, but in every way that matters to the people around them, they have stopped existing. Why would silence and averted eyes work as a punishment at all? If the group held your food, medicine, defense, and memory, being pushed outside it was more than a social inconvenience. It could threaten survival. In many settings, exclusion worked as a slow sentence carried out through absence rather than force. But the deprivation went further than the practical. Belonging does something for a person beyond keeping them fed and safe. It confirms that they're real, that being seen and acknowledged by others is part of how anyone holds on to the sense that their life counts for something. Psychologists who study exclusion describe it as an attack on several needs at once. The need to belong, the need to feel some control over one's world, the need to hold on to self-worth, and the need to feel that one's life has meaning. Being cast out can strike at all four together. Some of this has been tested in careful, almost deceptively simple experiments. In one well-known design, a person plays a small ball-tossing game on a screen with two other players, who are actually controlled by a computer. After a few friendly rounds, the other players quietly stop throwing the ball their way. Nothing is said. No insult is delivered. Within minutes, most people report a real dip in mood and in their sense of self-worth, from a game that, on paper, cost them nothing at all. Later versions of the experiment found the sting holds up, even when people are told beforehand that the other players are just a computer program. Knowing it isn't real doesn't seem to fully protect against it. One of our common words for exclusion has a specific civic origin. In ancient Athens, citizens could vote once a year to send a prominent fellow citizen into exile for a decade, without any formal charge against him. The institution is traditionally linked to reforms from the late 6th century BCE, though the ostracisms we actually have record of mostly date from the century after, and appear to have been used only a limited number of times. Historians still debate exactly what the practice was for: a safety valve against tyranny, a weapon in factional rivalry, or some shifting mix of both. Each voter scratched a name onto a broken piece of pottery, an ostracon, and dropped it into a jar. With enough shards naming the same man, he had 10 days to leave. He kept his property and his life, but lost, for 10 years, his place among people who had known him since childhood. The potsherd gave the practice its name. The practice gave us a word we still use: ostracism. The word now covers many everyday forms of exclusion. Another phrase belongs to a much heavier history: social death. We should handle that phrase with care. It became especially influential through the sociologist Orlando Patterson's analysis of slavery, where it described the stripping away of recognized kinship, ancestry, rights, and social standing. The term has since been extended to other grave injustices. People under rigid caste systems, those denied the basic standing of a member of society at all. But its modern scholarly weight comes largely from Patterson's account of the enslaved, cut off from kin, name, homeland, and any recognized place in the social order. That's a very heavy weight, and it shouldn't be spent cheaply. Social death, in its full sense, isn't an awkward afternoon or a message left unanswered. It names a deep and often violent removal from the human community, alive in body, erased in every social sense that gives a life its footing. We raise it here not to flatten it, but because it marks one end of a spectrum we all live somewhere on. It shows, in its most extreme form, what human beings most fear losing. Not just company, but recognition. The plain fact of being registered by others as someone who is here, and who counts. fainter versions of that fear turn up much closer to home, nowhere near the same weight but recognizable in their small way. Being in a workplace where your presence or absence seems to register with no one. The slow drift of being eased out of a friend group, no confrontation, just a gradual thinning of invitations. The practice people now call ghosting, where someone you were close to simply stops responding and you're left holding silence where a person used to be. Calling an unanswered message or an awkward afternoon social death would flatten a term built for far graver conditions. Everyday exclusion is not equivalent to enslavement or civic erasure. It can still touch the old fear of becoming socially absent while physically present, which is why comparatively small rejections can land with surprising force. For a human being, it may be that being alone isn't actually the worst thing. The worst thing may be being among others and registering with almost none of them. The group could keep a person alive and still press hard against them. The same closeness that made exile frightening also made privacy difficult, reputation heavy, and departure costly. What looks warm from a distance could feel intrusive from inside it. The human past was not a simple refuge from loneliness. It came with rules, claims, and very little room to disappear. Life among the same few dozen people left a little room for disappearing. They saw what you ate, who you argued with, how you behaved when you were tired or afraid, and which version of yourself appeared after a bad night. In many small mobile communities, physical privacy was genuinely limited. Thin shelters, close quarters, little room to disappear even for an hour. That didn't mean privacy or personal space were absent altogether. Different societies drew those lines in different places through custom, distance, or simply where people chose to sit. But concealing a personal matter from the people around you for long was often much harder than it is now. For all its warmth, that closeness was also a kind of pressure many of us today would find hard to bear. When we picture the close-knit human past, we tend to fill it with belonging and leave out the constant low-grade visibility that came with it. Warmth and pressure were not opposites there. In small, tightly bound communities, a great deal about a person was known, simply because there was nowhere for it to hide. Reputation carried weight, and reputation was fragile. A single act of selfishness, cowardice, or arrogance could follow someone for years, carried and reshaped in the low murmur of talk about who did what. Talk about other people was more than background noise. It was a tool of social control. It rewarded those who shared, shamed those who hoarded, and helped a community enforce its expectations. It also meant that a person was continually being weighed by the opinions around them. There's a striking example of this from the Zhuangzi people of the Kalahari, documented by the anthropologist Richard Lee. When a hunter returned to camp having killed a large animal, you might expect celebration. Instead, the group would often do the opposite, mock the kill, call the meat thin, scrawny, barely worth the walk home. A hunter might arrive dust-covered and worn out, dragging far more meat than his own family could eat, only to be met with theatrical disappointment, someone sighing that it hardly seemed worth the trouble. Lee understood the mockery as a levelling practice. The target was not skill itself, but the possibility that skill might harden into arrogance or authority the group hadn't agreed to. Whatever any individual hunter privately felt in the moment, the custom itself did a specific piece of work. It made it harder for anyone to tower over the others for long. The practice helped keep people level, but it carried its own pressure. Genuine skill could still be met with public deflation, because the group was wary of allowing achievement to become rank. equality was protected in part by limiting how far individual pride could expand. In other foraging societies, that same pressure appeared in different forms. Expectations around sharing were sometimes strong enough that a person could not treat the results of their labour as entirely private. Others could make claims under local custom, and refusing them carried a real social cost. Anthropologists sometimes call this demand sharing. Resources could move across households according to established obligations and needs. It functioned as a safety net, while also limiting the idea that possessions belonged to one person alone. These societies were not uniformly grim. They also held laughter, intimacy, and security. Belonging and freedom could pull in different directions, because being fully held by a group also meant being fully accountable to it, sometimes in ways that protected people, and sometimes in ways that made escape difficult. The camp itself was not always fixed. Many mobile foraging societies were considerably more fluid than the image of an unchanging tribe, with the same faces in the same place forever. People moved. In a number of mobile foraging societies, groups split apart and came back together as the seasons, the food, and people's tempers required, a pattern anthropologists call fission and fusion. A camp might swell in a good season and scatter in a lean one. This flexibility could ease real pressure. If a feud festered or a bully rose too far, leaving was sometimes a genuine option, one that didn't require confrontation. Researchers who have tracked this kind of mobility over time describe camp composition changing substantially from month to month, sometimes week to week, as households recalculated where their strongest ties currently were. But it wasn't simple or universally open. Where a person could go depended on the local ecology, on which relatives or in-laws might take them in, on whether another group was willing to accept another mouth to feed, and on the standing that person already carried. Not everyone had somewhere to walk to. Fission and fusion gave some people real room to maneuver. It didn't loosen the group's hold on everyone equally. Still, the possibility mattered for those who had it. Belonging was not always an absolute cage. The group made real demands, but some people could move among more than one network of kin, friendship, and obligation. The lost paradise disappears on closer inspection. These worlds asked a great deal of people. They exchanged some privacy for security, some independence for support, and some individual glory for group survival. The opposite of loneliness was not always freedom. Sometimes it was obligation, being known so completely that a person could never fully step outside the group's gaze. What many modern societies have moved away from was never simply good, but it was not nothing either. It was a dense web of mutual need, mutual knowledge, and mutual claim, one that held people tightly, for better and for worse. How was that web actually woven? If belonging was this powerful, this binding, human beings must have had ways of building and maintaining it, day after day, night after night. After dark, Story did some of that work. By late afternoon in a Juhuanzi camp, much of the talk around the fire concerned the immediate work of living together. Food, plans, obligations, disagreements, and the small adjustments required by life in close company. Practical matters were often handled where other people could hear, respond, and add what they knew. Something shifted once the sun went down. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years recording exactly this shift among the Juhuanzi of the Kalahari, comparing what people talked about by day with what they talked about once the fire became the main source of light. Her recordings found day talk dominated by economic and social matters, complaints, negotiations, the small frictions of shared life. Night talk moved somewhere else entirely. Stories, distant kin, the dead, the spirit world, memories reaching back decades. The Zhu Huanxi are a living people, not a window frozen open onto the deep past. They have lived through colonization, land loss, and considerable change, like every society on Earth. What Wiesner recorded is a snapshot of one community at one moment, suggestive rather than a blueprint for how all humans everywhere once spent their evenings, and other foraging societies may well have drawn the line between day and night talk differently. Firelight extended the usable day. Once the urgent work eased, people had a stretch of waking time that did not have to be spent solving an immediate problem, and they filled much of it with stories. Children absorbed a great deal in that stretch. Not lists of rules. A story in which someone hoarded food while neighbours went hungry, and then lived with the consequences, could do more work than a flat instruction. It gave the lesson a face, a sequence, and an outcome a child could remember. The child might forget the exact warning, but remember the character's fate, the laughter or disapproval around the telling, and the moment when the choice finally came back to meet them. The story itself wasn't fixed either. A version told to frighten a 5-year-old away from wandering off alone wasn't quite the version told to a teenager, weighing whether to leave the group over a grudge. The plot might stay recognisable across decades, but the emphasis shifted with whoever was telling it and whoever was listening. New details folded in, old ones quietly dropped, until a tale from a grandmother's own childhood carried the weight of several generations' worth of small adjustments without anyone ever deciding formally to revise it. Stories could also absorb a daytime friction without forcing it into a direct confrontation. They gave a group room to talk around a problem before anyone had to talk straight through it. An ordinary version might look like this. Someone was short with a friend that afternoon or kept more than a fair share, and nobody raised it directly. After dark, the storyteller turns to an old tale about a hoarder, a quick-tempered hunter, or a companion who snapped for no good reason. The circle laughs at the familiar moment, goes quiet before the ending, or says part of it aloud because everyone has heard this one before. No finger points. The person who recognises themselves in the story can laugh too, catch the resemblance privately, and adjust course without having to lose face in front of the group. The tale belongs to everyone, which lets the judgment belong to no single accuser. A story creates a little distance between the behaviour and the person who committed it. A character can be criticised more openly than the neighbour sitting 3 feet away, allowing the judgment to land without forcing a public confrontation. Wiesner's recordings do not document this exact scene, but the broader shift she observed, from daytime practical matters toward remembered events and imagined worlds, leaves room for tensions to enter sideways rather than head-on. A grievance that might have caused a scene at noon could, by nightfall, be carried inside a story older than the disagreement itself. A child hears the same tale several times across childhood, and something different lands each time. First the plot, later the judgment buried inside it, later still the memory of who in the family used to tell it, and how. Repetition did real work here too. The same joke landing in the same spot in a story, year after year, wasn't laziness. It was a kind of rehearsal, a way of confirming again that everyone in the circle still shared the same reference points, the same sense of what was funny, tragic, or worth a quiet shake of the head. Distant people stayed close through this as well. A cousin 2 valleys away, or a relative mentioned by a travelling hunter, could remain part of a person's social world despite going unseen for months or years. A story about that person, told in front of everyone, updated the whole group's sense of where they were, what they had been doing, and whether they seemed to be thriving or struggling. The information became communal as soon as it was spoken aloud, rather than staying locked inside whoever happened to hear it first. The dead did something similar. This wasn't ancestor worship in any formal sense necessarily. Often it was smaller and more ordinary than that. A joke someone used to make, a way of walking, a dish nobody else knew how to prepare quite right. Repeating these details kept a person present in the group's daily reference points long after their body was gone. This was not a passive process either. Listeners asked questions, added their own fragments of news, and argued about details. A story changed as it travelled, shaped by the people in the circle rather than delivered intact by a single voice. A child raised on the same handful of stories did not only learn what happened to careless or selfish people in them, they absorbed, slowly and without being told directly, some sense of what their own people considered worth admiring, worth mocking, or worth quietly avoiding. All of this added up to something larger than any single story, a shared imagination. People who have heard the same tales, laughed at the same running jokes, argued over the same old disputes buried in a myth, carry a we that doesn't need to be stated out loud. It just sits underneath everything else they do together. Modern media can create the same kind of shared reference, but not automatically. The fire gathered a group around one unfolding story. A screen can give a household one story to argue over together, or 4 separate feeds, each quietly deciding what its viewer will see next. A family that watches the same show together, pausing it to argue over what a character should have done, can turn that argument into a private joke that lasts for years. 4 people in the same room, each on a separate screen, can spend an evening together without sharing a single story. A household that has watched the same series for a decade may quote entire scenes and mean something private by them. A book club that meets monthly for years often becomes less about the books than about the arguments they provoke, and the fact that the same people keep returning to have them. Online communities can develop their own shared memory in much the same way. The medium matters less than whether people continue handling the story together after it ends. A story takes on a different social life when people discuss, dispute, quote, and remember it together, rather than consuming it in parallel and reaching for the next thing before the credits finish. A community held itself together, partly through the stories it told about the wider world. But that was only half the work. People also needed to carry knowledge about each other, who could be trusted, who had changed, who was quietly struggling. And that kind of knowledge moved through a very different channel. In a small community, information could travel through a chain of ordinary observations. A person seemed unsteady the night before. By morning, several others knew to check on her. Someone who had shared generously during an earlier shortage might later be remembered when he needed help himself. Nobody had to announce either fact formally. One person mentioned what they had noticed, another added something from the previous day, and the knowledge gradually became part of what the group understood about the situation. This is usually filed under one unglamorous word: gossip. But looked at closely, gossip is doing several things at once. It's tracking who kept a promise. It's noticing illness before it becomes an emergency. It's building a rough, constantly updated map of who's dependable in a crisis and who isn't, assembled the way most reputations are, through small, half-noticed moments stacked up over years, until a person's name carries a fairly reliable shorthand for what to expect from them. The same map also tracked smaller things, who tended to exaggerate a story in their own favour, whose account of a dispute usually needed a second opinion before anyone trusted it completely. That map lowers the cost of trusting someone new, and it makes a pattern of taking without giving back much harder to hide. The map was never perfectly neutral. A person with more relatives, a louder voice, or greater status could shape the story told about someone else. A reputation might preserve a useful warning, or harden a misunderstanding into something difficult to escape. The same informal system that made cooperation possible also gave local prejudice somewhere to live. Some of this map was passed along on purpose, aimed at a specific decision a person was about to make. Before agreeing to lend a tool, take on a shared task, or trust someone with a debt, a person might be pulled aside and told quietly, "He always promises to return what he borrows. Ask Mara how that went." Such a warning can fold a group's accumulated experience into a decision someone is about to make, protecting them from a bad arrangement before it happens, and raising the cost of repeated unreliability. Word can travel faster than any single unpaid debt. The listener, however, is being asked to trust a story they may have no easy way to verify before the decision is already upon them. The warning may be accurate, or it may carry an old grudge. Status shapes whose account is believed, and reputations can resist evidence long after the original event has changed or been forgotten. The person being discussed may never hear the charge, much less answer it. Experiments on what researchers call prosocial gossip suggest that reputational warnings can affect partner choice and cooperation under some conditions. The finding is narrow. A warning changes the situation for the person it names, whether the warning is fair or not. It does not mean gossip has one clean purpose, or that groups reliably reach accurate verdicts about their own members. Children picked up this map early, long before they could have explained what they were doing. They noticed which adults responded patiently, who followed through after making a promise, whose version of a dispute others treated with caution, and how the room changed when a particular person began to speak. One idea in this area, associated with the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, treats this kind of talk as an extension of something older: physical grooming among primates, which cements alliances one relationship at a time. As primate groups grow larger, maintaining every bond through one-to-one grooming becomes increasingly time-consuming. There are only so many hours in a day, and grooming reaches one partner at a time. Dunbar proposed that conversation may have let humans solve a problem grooming physically couldn't, maintaining several relationships at once, in roughly the time it takes to tell one story. Whatever role gossip played in the origin of language, speech clearly lets social information move among several people in a way one-to-one physical contact cannot. It's a compelling idea, and it remains exactly that, an idea. Language may well have other, competing origins, and comparing a picked-through coat of fur to an evening of conversation is useful only up to a point. The two aren't identical, just suggestively similar. Being known this closely wasn't only about surveillance either. Trading real information about yourself with someone else can be its own kind of closeness. A friend who says, unprompted, "I've never told anyone this," is handing over more than information. They're testing, in a small and reversible way, whether the friendship can hold something with real weight in it. Carrying that weight carefully, without repeating it, can deepen a friendship in ways that months of pleasant, low-stakes conversation may not. A relationship made entirely of safe surfaces can remain warm and enjoyable, while still never becoming the place either person turns when something difficult happens. That's the warm side. The same channel that carries trust can carry damage just as easily. A rumour, once loose, doesn't ask permission to keep circulating. A private failure, aired at the wrong moment, can follow someone for years in a group too small to let anything go. Being known in these settings cut in both directions, sometimes within the same afternoon. The damage was not limited to obvious lies. A true fact repeated without its context could become just as distorting. Information offered in confidence might be passed on as concern, then retold as evidence, until the person at the centre no longer recognised the version of themselves moving through the group. There is a particular tiredness in being visible all the time. Someone who has just moved to a new town, unrecognised by anyone in the grocery store, may ache for a place where people would notice if they stopped appearing. That same person, a year later, after neighbours have begun commenting on which nights they come home late, may long for a few days in which nobody keeps track. Most people would probably want both: enough visibility to be known, and enough privacy not to feel watched. Communities rarely offer either entirely on our own terms. What has changed is less the impulse than its reach. In a small community, a rumour usually remained local, and arrived inside a larger history of what people already knew about the person involved. That context gave others something against which to judge the claim: memories, contradictions, and knowledge of the speaker. A story about a stranger can now reach millions who have never met them, stripped of the surrounding information that once limited how far a reputation could travel. A thread to return to when the story reaches screens and crowds too large to know personally. Children begin learning this social map before they understand the network around them. Care is where the record first takes shape, through the adults and older children who notice, guide, and remember them. Researchers observing mixed-age actor children's groups in the Philippines, and similar arrangements in several other foraging societies, describe children of different ages spending long stretches together. Older children often guide and supervise younger ones, while much of the ordinary negotiation of play happens among the children themselves. Much of the learning appears to happen laterally, through observation, correction, and example passed between children only a few years apart in age, rather than through direct adult instruction. This isn't children raising themselves. Adults remain part of the wider care environment, even while much of the immediate play and negotiation unfolds among children. Supervision is spread beyond a single caregiver bent over a single child. An older sibling minding a younger one is doing real work, whether or not anyone formally names it as such. This is not evidence of one correct, universal way to raise a human child. The Agta are a living people with their own history, including contact with settled agriculture, national governments, missionary activity, logging, and land disputes. And the arrangements anthropologists observe today are not a clean window onto everyone's deep past. What the pattern shows is more modest. Spreading the work of watching children across people of different ages is a viable, well-documented human arrangement, not the only correct one and not a lost golden age. That distribution goes further than children looking after children. Grandparents feature heavily in many societies' caregiving arrangements. So do aunts, uncles, elder cousins, and people with no blood tie at all who simply live nearby and have become, through years of proximity, part of a child's expected circle of care. Exactly how this gets arranged differs enormously. Some societies lean on grandmothers specifically, others on sibling networks, others on entire neighbourhoods sharing the load loosely and informally. In some societies, cousins raised in the same household are barely distinguished, linguistically or practically, from siblings. In others, a child might spend more waking hours inside an unrelated neighbour's household than inside their own parents', without anyone treating this as especially unusual. The common thread isn't a specific arrangement, it's that the work rarely stayed contained inside a single nuclear household, and it would be dishonest to suggest every extended family is automatically a safe or generous one. One influential hypothesis links women's unusually long post-reproductive lifespan partly to the support grandmothers can provide to descendants. It remains debated, and its relevance varies across societies, but it keeps attention on a simple fact. Older adults can remain socially and practically important long after their own childbearing years. None of this is a case against any particular modern family. Single parents have always existed, and plenty of children have been raised well by one exhausted, devoted adult. The more useful question isn't whether any given household measures up to some ancient ideal. It's simpler than that. Are today's two working adults, alone in an apartment with a toddler, trying to do by themselves what a great many human societies have spread across grandparents, older kids, neighbours, and extended kin? Two working parents today are often attempting something that many wider care networks distribute among several adults and older children, informally and unevenly. Bedtime, meals, a sick day, or a school pickup moved an hour earlier without warning may now have only one or two possible responders. If both are already stretched thin, the problem has nowhere else to go. In a wider network, several people might plausibly step in, even if no one followed a formal schedule. Asking for help under these conditions can feel like admitting failure, partly because modern households tend to keep the work of care inside their own four walls. A parent who calls a neighbour to watch a sick child for an afternoon may feel they're crossing a boundary, asking for something exceptional rather than using a routine part of community life. Seen this way, parental exhaustion looks less like personal failure and more like a structural mismatch. A small number of adults carrying responsibilities that many societies have distributed more widely. A single working parent managing bedtime, homework, dinner, illness, and paid work alone is not failing at a universal human task. They may be carrying alone what other social arrangements have shared. The strain often appears in small calculations rather than dramatic collapse. Whether to wake a child and take them along to an appointment, whether to ask the same friend for help again, whether one parent can miss another shift, whether a grandparent living 3 hours away can realistically become part of an emergency plan. Each problem is manageable on its own. Their accumulation is what exhausts people. That difference runs in both directions. A child raised inside a wide net of familiar adults and older children is not only surrounded by more potential care, the adults are less alone too, because responsibility for every difficult hour does not fall on the same one or two people. A child with several trusted adults is also less exposed when any single relationship becomes strained, distracted, or temporarily unavailable. None of this guarantees safety or harmony, but it gives care more than one place to land. A wider network also gives a child several ways of being known. One adult may understand the child's fear, another their humour, another the quiet competence that disappears in a classroom or at home. No single person has to hold the complete account of who that child is. Blood was never the only way a person entered such a circle. Family could be made through repeated care as well as inherited at birth. At a baptism, an adult with no blood relation to a child may accept a public role in that child's life. In some Catholic communities, particularly in Latin America, compadrazgo can create lasting expectations of advice, assistance, and mutual support that reach well beyond the ceremony. The relationship may bind godparents and biological parents to one another as well as to the child, although its duties and importance vary greatly from one community to another. In some places it remains largely ceremonial. In others, it becomes part of the practical network through which people seek help, influence, and protection. That's one version of an old pattern. Kinship built by ceremony and repeated care, not only by birth. None of these bonds ran on ceremony alone. A godparent who showed up once and never again wouldn't carry the same weight as one who returned year after year at birthdays, illnesses, and ordinary dinners. The initial act mattered less than what came after it, which is true of most kinds of kinship made or inherited. It shows up in smaller, less formal ways constantly. A family that fled one country for another finds itself, a few years in, calling the older couple next door aunt and uncle, despite no blood tie whatsoever, because that couple fed them through a hard winter, watched their kids after school, and appeared unasked the week someone was in the hospital. It wasn't a single dramatic gesture that earned them the title. It was years of small, repeated presence, the kind that only slowly earns a kinship term. This kind of substitution tends to emerge fastest wherever a biological family is geographically or emotionally out of reach. Among migrants an ocean away from parents and siblings, among people estranged from difficult households, among anyone who has had to build a support system from whoever happened to be nearby and willing. These relationships can become so ordinary that nobody remembers when the family language first appeared. The neighbour begins as the person with a spare key, then becomes the person called from the hospital, then the person included automatically when a holiday meal is planned. The title follows the work rather than creating it. Two friends who spent 15 years managing each other's illnesses, grief and rent become, in every functional sense, each other's family, long before either would think to use that word out loud. At a funeral, it's sometimes those friends, not the cousins who share the deceased's last name, who can answer the smaller, harder questions. Which songs mattered to them, how they liked their coffee, what they were quietly afraid of near the end. Proximity and repeated care in cases like this can end up knowing a person more thoroughly than blood ever did. Anthropologists use several terms for relationships of this kind, including fictive kin and chosen family. In Islamic legal traditions, nursing can establish recognized milk-kin ties between people with no biological relation, including marriage prohibitions later in life. It does not make every legal consequence identical to biological kinship, but it shows that ancestry is not the only recognized basis for family connection. Other kinship systems have likewise treated ritual, adoption, shared substance, or sustained care as grounds for real obligation. The precise rules differ. The broader pattern is that relatedness can be made as well as inherited. This matters especially for people who have lost or never had a reliable biological family to draw on. For many LGBTQ+ people rejected or cut off by relatives, chosen family is not a comforting phrase from a movie. It may mean the person who sits through a diagnosis, provides a place to stay, becomes an emergency contact, or arrives when something goes wrong at 2 a.m. Plenty of LGBTQ+ people remain close to their birth families, and chosen family often layers onto existing ties rather than replacing them. Chosen families can also fracture, exclude, and distribute care unevenly. Being chosen does not make a relationship effortless. What gives the phrase its weight is the willingness to assume responsibilities that no shared surname automatically requires. They may also carry responsibilities that remain legally fragile. A close friend can know a person's medications, routines, and wishes more intimately than anyone else, and still find themselves treated as a visitor in a hospital or excluded from decisions after a death. Social kinship can be real long before institutions know what to do with it. Romantic partnership can carry enormous emotional and practical weight. The problem begins when it is expected to replace an entire social world. In much of modern life, close friendships are treated as softer, more optional ties, easier to postpone when work or family becomes demanding. Yet a friend who has quietly kept track of someone's difficult years, the divorce, the diagnosis, the year everything fell apart at once, may have performed much of the care that kinship requires without ever being given the name. The relationship survives through repeated acts that look unimpressive from the outside, remembering the appointment, keeping the spare key, making the call nobody else thought to make. Kinship across a lot of these worlds wasn't only a fact settled at birth. It was something people kept doing, over and over, long after the ceremony, or the first act of care that started it. Kinship did not maintain itself after a ceremony or a change of name. It survived through returns, favours, remembered obligations, and the ordinary work of showing up after the crisis had passed. A market transaction, at its cleanest, ends the moment it's finished. Money changes hands, the goods change hands, and neither party owes the other anything further. That cleanness is often the whole point. A gift, in a lot of human societies, was built to do the opposite. It left something unfinished, on purpose. Among the Jew/Huanzi, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner, the same researcher who documented the shift from day talk to night talk, spent years mapping a practice called Exile, long-distance exchange partnerships linking people who might live in different camps and see one another only occasionally. An object such as a string of ostrich eggshell beads could pass from one partner to another without any discussion of when or how it would be answered. A year or more might pass before something moved in the other direction. The delay was not a lapse in manners. It kept the relationship unfinished, preserving a reason to visit and an expectation that contact would continue. The object mattered, but so did the future encounter implied by its movement. That mattered practically as much as socially. When a drought emptied out the resources around one camp, a person with yarrow partners elsewhere could arrive through an established relationship rather than as a complete stranger. Wiesner argued that these far-reaching ties helped people spread ecological risk across more than one place, giving movement a social route as well as a geographical one. The ties required maintenance and were unevenly distributed. A person with fewer or weaker partnerships had less support to draw on. Zorro was neither a one-time investment nor pure generosity. It was a relationship tended over years, with memory, patience, and obligation attached. A more elaborate version of the same basic idea existed among the Trobriand Islanders and their neighbours in a ceremonial exchange system called Kula. Particular necklaces travelled one direction around a wide ring of islands. Particular arm shells travelled the other, carried on long, sometimes dangerous canoe voyages between established partners according to strict protocol. The voyages themselves involved real risk, crossing open water in canoes prepared with considerable ceremony, and a successful journey added to a partner standing in its own right, independent of what was actually exchanged. A particular necklace or arm shell carried its own biography, which islands it had passed through, which renowned partners had once held it, and a partner's standing could rise considerably simply through having briefly possessed an especially famous piece before passing it along. It would flatten Kula badly to describe it as neighbours swapping jewellery to make friends. Later researchers, including Annette Weiner, building on and complicating the anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski's original account, have shown Kula bound up with rank, political alliance, and years of accumulated obligation between specific partners, a serious structured institution running alongside, not replacing, the ordinary trade also happening on those same voyages. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss, writing decades ago about gift economies broadly, argued that gifts across many cultures carry a triple obligation: to give, to accept, and eventually to return. Mauss's central claim was that a truly free gift, with absolutely no expectation attached, is rarer than it looks, that most gift-giving carries an unspoken pressure to respond, and that refusing a gift in many societies can itself be read as an insult or a declaration of hostility. This helps explain why declining a gift can feel like more than declining an object. In many settings, it can be read as declining the relationship the gift was offering to extend. A gift, in other words, is rarely as free as it looks. It can carry warmth and real generosity, and at the same time function as a quiet display of status, or a way of placing the receiver, whether they like it or not, in a position of owing something back. Smaller versions of this logic are still recognizable now. Someone helps a friend move apartments on a Saturday, hauling boxes for 6 hours and refusing payment beyond pizza. Months later, when that friend needs a ride to the airport at 5 in the morning, both understand that the earlier favour is part of the relationship's memory, even if neither calls it a debt. Naming the ledger too plainly would make the exchange feel colder. Rotating savings groups, known by names such as Susu, Tanda, or Hui in different communities, likewise move money through trust, reputation, and regular contributions outside formal banking contracts. Participants receive the pooled amount in turn and rely on the others to keep contributing after their own turn has passed. The form is financial, but the mechanism still depends on a social future. That unspoken scorekeeping has a harder edge too. A gift can just as easily be used to place someone in a person's debt deliberately. A boss who does an employee an unusual favour, an in-law who provides a large sum toward a wedding, a wealthy relative whose generosity comes wrapped in an expectation of loyalty or gratitude that never quite gets stated outright. The same mechanism that keeps affectionate relationships open-ended can keep unequal ones open-ended too, in exactly the same way. An efficient transaction ends cleanly. A relationship rarely does. A retired man who spent his weekends repairing neighbours' fences without charging may simply say, "That's what people do around here." This sentence rests on a belief that help should circulate eventually, without every return being specified in advance. It also leaves room for the return to take another form: a meal after an illness, a ride when the car fails, or somebody checking the house during a long absence. Many bonds require little explanation once people have learned how to perform them. They appear in song, dance, shared labour, and grief carried in the presence of others, in bodies moving, breathing, or speaking in time. A dozen voices find the same note at roughly the same moment, and something in the room changes that has nothing to do with the words being sung. It might happen in a small country church on a Sunday morning, in a stadium chanting the same 3 syllables over and over until they stop meaning anything and start meaning everything, or in a line of people at a wake, murmuring the same responses in the same rhythm they've heard their whole lives without ever once studying it. People who move, chant, or sing in unison, at a funeral, in a place of worship, at a protest holding the same slow step, often report feeling closer to the people around them afterward than they did before. Closer in a way that's hard to produce through conversation alone. None of this requires elaborate ritual. Marching in step, clapping along to the same beat at a concert, or simply walking alongside someone who happens to match your pace for a few blocks can produce a small version of the same effect. The effect can appear in quieter forms too. 2 people carrying a heavy table begin to match their steps without discussing it. Workers repeat the same motion beside one another until a pace emerges. A parent rocks a crying child and finds their own breathing slowing to the rhythm they're trying to create. Coordination is practical first, but the shared timing can leave an emotional trace. A 2015 study published in Biology Letters tested part of this directly. High school students in Brazil performed synchronized or non-synchronized movement at different levels of exertion. Researchers measured pain threshold, an indirect proxy sometimes used in this line of research, alongside participants' reported sense of social bonding. Those who moved in synchrony later showed higher pain thresholds and reported stronger bonding, even when exertion was considered separately. The researchers interpreted the pain threshold result as consistent with an endorphin-based account, but they did not measure endorphins directly. Nor did the study show that synchrony creates empathy, morality, or durable friendship. It offered a narrower finding. Coordinated movement can measurably alter how connected people feel in the moment. Two social theorists gave names to different aspects of this experience. Emil Durkheim called the heightened emotional energy of shared ritual collective effervescence. Drawing on the ethnographic reports available to him about Aboriginal Australian religious life, he described gatherings in which the feeling of the group seemed larger than what any participant brought alone. Victor Turner used communitas for the temporary levelling of status that can emerge during rites of passage, based on his fieldwork among Dembu communities in what is now Zambia. The concepts overlap but are not identical. One emphasises emotional charge, the other a suspension of ordinary hierarchy. Later scholars have questioned how universal either experience is and how strongly cultural expectations shape what participants feel. Both remain useful descriptions rather than universal laws. Grief may be where this shows up with the least ambiguity. In many Shiva observances, mourners spend 7 days largely at home while relatives and community members visit, bring food and take over practical tasks. Customs vary, but the arrangement gives grief a social container and makes the ordinary work of a household somebody else's concern for a while. Irish wakes have often brought people together around the body, sometimes through the night, with conversation, food, stories, prayer, and laughter alongside sorrow. In many such gatherings, the dead person is repeatedly returned to the room through anecdote, and mourning is not treated as something one household should carry alone. The visitors do not remove the grief. They change its surroundings. Somebody pours the tea before the mourner notices the cup is empty. Somebody answers the door, remembers which relative has not been called, or tells a story that allows the dead person to be funny again for a few minutes. The work is mundane, which may be why it helps. Sorrow is given company without being forced to become a performance. Modern life still has versions of this. Funerals happen, meal trains form. Religious communities, friends, and online groups can create real spaces for shared mourning. Yet short bereavement leave, distance from extended family, small households, and the treatment of grief as a private, emotional problem can return a bereaved person to ordinary obligations very quickly. A worker may be expected back at a desk within days, composed enough to continue, while practical help fades as other people's schedules resume. Institutions can measure leave on a calendar. Grief does not organise itself by the same one. The loneliest part may arrive after the formal gathering, when the flowers are fading and everyone else has returned to the ordinary pace of work. Messages become less frequent. Food stops arriving. The bereaved person may still be learning how to enter a silent house, while the surrounding world behaves as though the event has already moved into the past. Before belonging became an idea people could describe out loud, it may have been something felt first in the body, in the rhythm of other people's voices, footsteps, and breath, moving the same way at the same time. The same mechanisms that bind a group through song or shared movement can also sharpen its boundary against outsiders. Military drill and nationalist rallies make use of synchrony, and a crowd chanting together can direct its emotional force toward a person or group already marked as an enemy. Shared rhythm does not carry its own moral instruction. It can support care, courage, and solidarity, or intensify exclusion, depending on the story, authority, and targets surrounding it. The bodily certainty of moving together may even make the group's judgment feel more self-evident than it did before the movement began. This is one reason rituals deserve attention beyond the beliefs they express. They do not merely tell people what a group values, they rehearse who is inside it, who leads, who follows, and where collective feeling is meant to go. The emotional force may be genuine even when the purpose it serves is cruel. Belonging had to be renewed. It lived in repeated stories, obligations, gestures of care, and familiar bodies moving together. But the conditions that made those repetitions ordinary did not remain the same. Homes became more permanent, populations grew, labour changed, and the distances between people took on new forms. The next part of the story begins when belonging becomes attached more firmly to place, household, property, and time. More than 11,000 years ago, a house in the eastern Mediterranean was rebuilt on the footprint of an earlier one. Then it was rebuilt again. Archaeologists who study the Natufian communities of the Levant have found this pattern repeatedly. People settling into one place for generations, in some cases well before anyone in the region was farming in any organised sense. Sedentism came first in parts of the world, not agriculture. The two are related but not the same story, and the shift from mobile to settled life unfolded unevenly, at different speeds in different regions, occasionally reversing for a generation before continuing. In some regions, the two developments ran centuries apart. In others, they overlapped closely enough that separating them requires fine-grained dating rather than a simple story. There was no single dramatic morning when humanity settled down. Some foraging societies built substantial, long-occupied settlements without ever adopting agriculture. Others farmed for centuries while still moving seasonally between fixed points. Mobility and settlement were never a clean either-or. What changed, gradually, was how much of daily life became anchored to a single, hard-to-move place. Once a house stood in one spot long enough, it started to hold things a shelter built for a season never could. Grain, stored in pits or against a wall, needed protecting as much as it needed producing. A new vulnerability alongside a new kind of security. Excavations at Çatalhöyük, a large settlement in what is now central Turkey, have found homes rebuilt directly above earlier ones across many generations, floors renewed again and again, and the dead interred beneath domestic floors and platforms. Excavators have often interpreted some of those platforms as sleeping areas, though the precise use of every surface remains open to debate. Ian Hodder and other researchers have also cautioned against reading a modern nuclear family back into these structures. A dwelling could have held changing combinations of relatives and unrelated residents across its long use. A permanent house could carry forms of continuity that a mobile shelter could not hold in quite the same way. Membership in a household increasingly shaped access to what it stored, who it cared for, and eventually what it could pass forward. A person born, raised, and buried within sight of the same walls had a different relationship to place than someone who slept in many camps across a year. Not necessarily a richer one, but one built through accumulated physical detail. A repaired patch in the plaster, the root water took after rain, the corner where tools were kept. Knowledge could settle into the structure itself. Mobile life carried its own deep maps, memories, and attachments. A fixed home allowed some of them to remain visible in the same material place. Settling down did not produce the same kind of society everywhere. Some early settlements show relatively little material difference between one dwelling and the next for long periods. Others developed larger homes, more elaborate interiors, or more uneven access to stored resources over time. None of this makes sedentism an automatic engine of hierarchy. Local ecology, inheritance, trade, political choices, and many other pressures shaped what permanence became. The narrower change is easier to see. Once wealth could be stored in land, buildings, animals, or durable supplies, advantage could remain in one place long enough to be defended, accumulated, and passed on. A permanent home offered real continuity. Familiar neighbours year after year, shared structures worth maintaining together, rituals returning to the same threshing floor or shrine each season. A place where a grandchild might be shown exactly where a grandparent used to sit. None of this required closeness with everyone in a settlement. It required only staying long enough for a place to accumulate its own history. The staying created its own obligations. Stored grain had to be defended, which meant it could also be hoarded. A house passed down meant one household's children inherited more than another's did, sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with either generation's character. Disputes that a mobile group might once have resolved by one side simply walking to another camp now had to be worked out among people bound to a house, a field, and years of stored effort. A household that had spent a decade building up a granary, a herd, or a reputation for skilled repair work had a great deal more to lose by walking away than a family with nothing yet invested in the place they stood. Moving to another village or household remained possible in many settled societies, but land, storage, and political boundaries changed the terms of leaving, raising the question of exactly what there would be to walk away from, and what a person would be starting over without. A family working the same field for 3 generations learned something. A family that moved to new ground each season never quite has to. What happens when the person you're in conflict with is also the person you'll need to share a harvest, a well, or a wall with for the rest of both your lives? Rootedness offered real security, and it tied people more tightly to a family, a debt, an inheritance, a rivalry, a status they hadn't necessarily chosen. As people settled into more permanent places, something else began to matter. Community was not built only through close kinship or deep friendship. Simply seeing familiar faces at a shared well, along a returning path, or near the same work area year after year became its own kind of social infrastructure. The people involved did not have to know one another intimately. Repetition could do some of the work on its own. Not every person who shaped a neighbourhood's feel of safety was someone you'd call a friend. In a farming village, a handful of households might draw water from a shared well each morning and cross a common courtyard on the way to an oven or a shrine. Some of these neighbours barely spoke beyond a greeting. They still knew each other's routines well enough to notice when something was off. None of this required deep affection. It required only that this handful of people kept crossing paths often enough to become part of each other's mental map of the place. That pattern carried into denser places too. In the crowded parishes and market squares of pre-industrial towns, a resident might recognise dozens of faces without knowing most of their names. The baker, a craft worker 2 doors down, the family running the same stall every market day. A shop could occupy one corner for decades. Neighbours who never shared a meal might still know one another's gait, voice, or daily route. Their exchanges were often tiny, a nod while shutters opened, a complaint about the weather, a few words while waiting for bread, but the accumulation mattered. Centuries later, versions of the texture appeared in North American cities and small towns. A regular seat at a diner counter, a barber who knew the cut without asking, a stoop where familiar neighbours sat through warm evenings. Nobody in these scenes had to solve anyone else's problems. Their presence kept the place from feeling entirely anonymous. None of these relationships needed to be close to matter. Community isn't built only from deep friendship. A great deal of it comes from repetition without intimacy. Familiar faces in familiar places, often enough that a stranger stops being a stranger without ever quite becoming a friend. The psychologist Stanley Milgram gave a name to a related phenomenon decades ago. The familiar stranger, someone encountered repeatedly and predictably at a bus stop, a train platform, a corner store, without a single word ever being exchanged. His work showed that people could recognize many of these figures around them. What that recognition contributes emotionally is harder to measure than recognition itself, but the category captures something ordinary and real. A person can remain unknown and still belong to the visual grammar of a place. In ordinary experience, strangers often become familiar long before they become known. The sociologist Mark Granovetter wrote about something related under the name weak ties, though his own focus was mostly on how loosely connected acquaintances pass along job leads and useful information that close friends often cannot. The idea matters here for a different reason. A cashier who has seen you weekly for 3 years, a neighbour whose schedule you have absorbed without meaning to, or a fellow commuter recognised by coat and posture alone may never become a confidant. Yet each confirms, in a small way, that daily life is taking place among recurring human beings rather than a procession of interchangeable crowds. You may know almost nothing about the person beyond the hour they arrive or the bag they carry. They still become part of the route. Their value may lie less in any single relationship than in the light social texture they create together, spread across an ordinary week. That isn't the same as saying weak ties prevent loneliness, or that they substitute for closer bonds. A person surrounded by familiar faces can still feel entirely unknown in any way that matters to them. What changes is narrower, whether daily life feels populated by people or simply moved through. Picture a person nursing a cup of coffee alone at a diner counter. No one joins their table, but the server already knows their order. In the corner booth, a familiar regular reads the newspaper he's read there most mornings for years. They've never had a real conversation. The room isn't unfamiliar, though. It holds a kind of low, undemanding recognition that a diner 4 states away full of strangers simply doesn't. It rarely gets noticed as meaningful until it's gone, until a favourite server moves away, or the diner closes, and the regular finds himself somewhere his order has to be explained from scratch. That comfort shows up in a library too. The presence of other readers working through their own separate tasks can feel like company, without any of company's usual demands. No eye contact required, no small talk owed, only the shared agreement to occupy the room quietly. Someone gets up to search a shelf, returns with 2 books, and settles back into the same chair. A student leaves for lunch and finds familiar figures still bent over their pages an hour later. Nothing intimate has happened. The afternoon has simply been spent among other lives. This kind of familiarity was never uniformly kind. The street that reassured one resident could leave another feeling watched. Small communities have long used repeated, face-to-face visibility to police behaviour as much as to offer comfort. A woman moving through the market each day might value being greeted by name and resent how quickly news of her movements reached relatives elsewhere. Newcomers, minorities, and people who did not fit local expectations could remain conspicuous long after everyone else had blended into the background. Repetition did not make a place welcoming. It deepened the social conditions already there. These encounters depended on actual places continuing to exist. When the diner closes, the bus route changes, the stall moves, or the bench disappears, the contact goes with it. The loss can look trivial on a map while altering the texture of an entire week. Much of what's been described here depended on more than a shared place. It depended on being in that place at the same hours as everyone else. That kind of familiarity took no particular effort to build. It asked only for time and for staying roughly where you already were. As the way time itself got organised began to change, the rhythm of this ordinary contact was about to change with it. Before dawn, a mill bell called workers from boarding houses and narrow streets toward the factory gate. None of them were unfamiliar with time before that bell. Farmers had always tracked the season by frost and flower. Sailors read tides that didn't wait for anyone. Church bells had marked prayer hours for centuries, and market days ran on fixed schedules long before any factory existed. What changed with industrial work wasn't the invention of timekeeping. It was how tightly a person's hours became tied to a wage, a shift, and a supervisor's clock. The historian E.P. Thompson traced part of this shift in a well-known account of English industrialisation, a movement from what he called task-oriented time toward clock time. His account describes a specific place, industrialising England, not a universal law applied evenly across every culture and era, and it shouldn't be read as proof that pre-industrial labour was uniformly slow, communal, or gentle. It had its own hard edges and hierarchies. Thompson was equally clear that workers did not accept the new discipline quietly. Strikes, unions, and decades of political struggle fought over exactly how much of a person's day a wage could claim, a fight that continues to shape how much of the week belongs to anyone besides an employer. The basic contrast remains useful in modest form. A task may end when the field is planted, the animals are fed, or it becomes too dark to continue. A shift begins and ends at hours set in advance and involves selling a defined portion of the day to whoever is paying for it. That is a real difference from task-based work, even if labour before industrialisation never fit neatly into one category and was often exhausting in its own ways. A single life can hold this transformation more clearly than any theory of it. Someone newly arrived in an industrial town, a long way from the village where they grew up, stands at a factory gate before dawn, knowing that their working hours will no longer bend to match a household's rhythm, a neighbour's needs, or a season's demands. Even the walk to that gate became something to be timed, planned around, budgeted for. A small daily negotiation that hadn't existed in quite the same form before. The day belongs, for a fixed stretch, to somebody else. The modern version needs no historical distance to picture. Work and travel absorb much of the day. Groceries, cooking, housework, children, older relatives, and the need to rest absorb more. A message proposing dinner can become a week of checking shifts, comparing calendars, finding childcare, and working out whether the journey across a large city still leaves enough energy for the conversation itself. One person is free Tuesday, another only Thursday, and by the time the first evening everyone can manage arrives, it is 3 weeks away. The friendship can remain deeply valued while becoming difficult to place inside an ordinary week. Picture someone working rotating shifts in a mid-sized North American city. On Sunday, she and a friend settle on Thursday dinner. By Wednesday, the schedule posted at work has moved her shift later. "Maybe I can come after 8, she writes, already unsure whether that's true. The shift runs long. There's a commute, then groceries that didn't get bought over the weekend, then a load of laundry that has to go in before morning. The dinner doesn't happen, not from any lack of wanting it, but because two lives that were briefly overlapping stopped overlapping partway through the week. Nobody ends the friendship over an evening like this. Nothing dramatic occurs. The two of them are still fond of each other, still intend to try again next week. The trouble sits somewhere quieter. A person's free time only becomes socially useful once it lines up with somebody else's, and an unpredictable schedule makes that overlap harder to arrange, not because anyone involved loves the other one less than before. This isn't unique to any one job. In some retail, hospitality, warehouse, care and gig arrangements, working hours can shift with little advance notice, leaving a person's actual free time to move under them. Recurring social contact needs a minimum of predictability. When a schedule changes weekly, plans must be renegotiated at the same rate, and that negotiation consumes energy a fixed routine never demanded. Over time, friends begin proposing plans loosely, sometime this week rather than Thursday, and every invitation acquires a quiet maybe. The friendship has not weakened. The calendar has stopped giving it a reliable place to happen. The easy conclusion here, that modern people are simply too busy for friendship, misses the more useful question underneath it. It isn't really about being busy. It's about what happens to a relationship once it depends on constant scheduling, transportation, childcare, and a certain amount of financial slack just to happen at all. Movement for work reshaped this further. Villages emptied into industrial cities. Migrant labourers followed factories, railroads, and mines across entire countries and oceans. A parent who left a rural hometown for factory work in a distant city might send money home for years, missing weddings, funerals, and ordinary Sundays, trading a dense web of daily contact for a thinner one sustained mostly by letters and occasional visits. Letters took time to arrive and answer. By the time news reached the absent person, a child had learned to walk, an illness had passed, or an argument had already cooled. Distance did not erase the relationship. It changed the kind of life the relationship could contain. They could carry letters, money sent home, a call on a birthday, news of an illness or a promotion, and a loyalty that held steady for decades with barely any contact to renew it. It carried less easily the ordinary texture of an unplanned evening. A dinner nobody scheduled in advance, a ride to an appointment, a face noticed to be off before any explanation was offered, an ordinary difficult Tuesday sat through simply because someone happened to already be in the room. People still do something like this today, relocating for a career or a degree and leaving behind friendships that once required no planning because they were already built into the week. Movement was not only a loss. Leaving could mean escape from a stifling household, access to a new community, education, economic possibility, or a kind of freedom a hometown never offered. People who migrate are not simply uprooted and passive. Many are making a difficult exchange, giving up one form of belonging while trying to build another. Markets expanded that freedom in another way. A person could buy food, call a repair service, arrange professional childcare, or seek medical expertise without depending on one particular neighbour, relative, or local craftsperson. These are substantial gains. Reliable services can protect dignity and independence, and very few people would prefer every broken pipe or medical need to create a permanent personal obligation. Some needs that once created occasions for informal reciprocity can now be met without involving anyone personally known to us. The paid solution may be faster, safer, more skilled, and fairer to the person doing the work. It also leaves no unfinished favour and no built-in reason to return. A small social opening closes at the exact moment a practical problem is solved. Karl Marx had a word for a related feeling: alienation, the sense of being cut off from what a person produces, from real control over how the work gets done, from the people working alongside them, whom a shifting labour market can just as easily turn into competitors as collaborators. It's a useful idea, best kept brief rather than treated as the whole explanation. Two people on the same shift for years learn to read each other without much conversation at all, a particular tiredness in how someone lifts a box, a silence that means something specific, a small change in the sound a familiar machine makes, the exact moment a person needs another pair of hands before they've asked for it. None of this shows up on a schedule or a paycheck. A shift lead who had spent 15 years on the same factory floor might know a co-worker's tells better than that co-worker's own family did. Evidence that solidarity and alienation were never mutually exclusive, even inside the very same building. Plenty of work has also produced genuine friendship, pride, and solidarity. A union hall built as much community as any market square once did. Under modern wage and urban systems, more forms of ordinary contact came to depend on separately available time, transport, childcare, and relief from work, resources that, in earlier arrangements, hadn't needed to be assembled quite so deliberately or purchased quite so directly. As that reorganization took hold outside, in the workplace and on the road to it, something was also changing inside the home. Home was becoming something else, not just where a family slept, but a separate world entirely, defined against everything happening outside its door. A young woman closes the door to her own room for the first time. Not a shared room, not a curtain across a corner, an actual door with a lock she controls, and stands there for a moment just feeling what the silence is like. That scene is not proof that privacy itself is a modern invention. People have always found ways to be alone, kept certain things unspoken, and drawn boundaries around parts of their lives. What became more common in some societies was a particular arrangement of smaller households, more specialized rooms, and stronger architectural divisions between household members and the world outside. These changes arrived unevenly, and many people never lived in the spacious private home the ideal seemed to assume. Those boundaries produced genuine freedoms. A person could leave a controlling family, choose their own partner, shape an identity that did not have to be renegotiated with an entire neighborhood, or simply know that withdrawal was possible. For many people who did not fit what a family or community considered normal, including many LGBTQ+ people, a door that locked from the inside could mark the difference between constant concealment and an ordinary private life. It also pulled a great deal of quiet labour behind that same door, out of anyone else's sight. Some of this shift has a physical, walkable history. The architectural historian Robin Evans wrote about European houses in which interconnected rooms gradually gave way to plans organised around corridors. A hallway let one person cross a home without moving through another person's space, separating circulation from social life inside the rooms. In an older, interconnected house, reaching the kitchen at night might mean walking through a room where someone else was sleeping, working, or having a private conversation, whether or not either party wanted the company. A corridor changed what movement required of a person, letting someone cross a house guided by nothing but their own errand, with no one else's presence to explain or apologize for along the way. The pattern was never universal or evenly available. A labourer's one-room dwelling and a wealthy household's many-roomed house, built in the same city in the same decade, offered nothing like the same privacy. In crowded tenements, several households might continue to share water, stairs, courtyards, and thin walls long after wealthier families had begun to live behind increasingly specialized doors. The family shape so often treated as the natural result of all this, two parents and their children living apart from the wider web of relatives who might once have shared a roof with them, has its own uneven history too. Family historians have shown how much households have varied across time and place, in size, in who counted as a member, in whether a home was mainly a place to produce a living, or mainly a place to rest from one. What did shift, in a lot of settings, was the home's function. Less a workshop, more a retreat. The romantic couple increasingly positioned as the emotional centre of a person's whole social world, with family idealised as a refuge from everything happening outside its walls. Somewhere in that shift, care work that had moved across wider networks collected more heavily behind a single front door. Someone had to sit up with a sick child, manage an aging parent's medication and appointments, prepare meals, clean, remember, and absorb emotional crises that no one outside the house might ever see. This work was not distributed evenly by gender. The person keeping the schedule and carrying the worry was, and often still is, disproportionately a woman. Ruth Schwartz Cowan argued that household technologies sometimes raise domestic standards, even as they reduce particular tasks. Changing household arrangements also reduced some forms of shared or paid assistance, while access to paid help remained strongly shaped by class. Picture an ordinary version of this labour unfolding behind one specific door. A parent sits up past midnight with a feverish child, checking a thermometer every 20 minutes, calculating whether morning is close enough to wait out or far enough to call someone. In the next room, or the next town, an aging parent's pill organiser needs refilling by Sunday, a schedule only one person is actually tracking. None of this appears on any list the outside world can see. A neighbour walking past that house the next morning would have no way of knowing that anyone inside had been awake for most of the night, or that the day ahead had already been quietly rearranged around it. Care can remain invisible simply because the need never crosses the front door. The neighbour who might gladly have taken a turn with a fever never learns there was a fever at all. No offer is refused. Nobody outside the household knows an offer is needed. A phrase like "behind closed doors" becomes literal. The work is happening, but its accumulation stays hidden until the person carrying it is already depleted. The household can look self-sufficient from the outside precisely because all the strain has been absorbed inside. A certain kind of sentence has become almost reflexive in describing all this. I don't want to bother anyone. I should be able to handle this myself. Everyone's so busy. I don't want to be a burden. These lines can protect autonomy and respect other people's limits. They can also become a way of shrinking a need until no one else has to witness it. A person may carry heavy bags up the stairs rather than call the neighbour who has offered help, or wait until a manageable problem has become a crisis, because asking earlier felt embarrassingly disproportionate. In some contemporary North American settings, ordinary dependence can begin to feel like a personal failure, rather than an expected part of living among other people. A parent down the street from that young woman's new room might be carrying every difficult hour of a child's care alone. The fever after midnight, the changed workday, the small calculation of which obligation can be dropped, without everything else collapsing. Farther away, an older person may live safely in a house built decades earlier for a family of 5 and pass an entire day without seeing another face. The rooms are familiar, the bills are paid, the doors lock properly. A smaller or more crowded home would not automatically have been kinder, but it might once have supplied contact without anyone having to request it. The front door protects both households. It also keeps their needs largely out of view. Privacy was never merely a retreat from a warmer communal world. Crowded households and close communities could hide violence, enforce conformity, and trap people in unpaid labour or economic dependence. For someone leaving those conditions, a private room could be the safest place they had ever known. It offered space to sleep without listening for footsteps, to invite the person they loved, to keep documents or money where nobody else could take them, or simply to arrange a life without constant permission. The door that kept scrutiny out could also leave care and struggle almost entirely inside. Its meaning depended on what stood on either side of it. As the household increasingly became the place where real intimacy was expected to live, the bonds outside it, friendships in particular, could start to feel less like an ordinary part of the week and more like something scheduled onto it, a shift this story will return to in full later on. Someone closes the door and sits alone in a room, arranged entirely around their own needs. The quiet is welcome. A moment later the phone lights up. Messages, group chats, and names from far beyond the room appear on the screen. The private space is suddenly crowded, though no one has entered it, and the door is still closed. Friends, half-familiar faces from a decade ago, a cousin 2 time zones away, a comedian she's never met, whose voice she could pick out of a crowd. 3 group chats left unopened for days. Somewhere in that flood are a few people who would come if she called from a hospital waiting room. The screen places them side by side, although their roles in her life are nothing alike and never have been. Late one night, unable to sleep and unwilling to wake anyone nearby, she sends a short message to a small online group about something her household would not quite understand. A reply comes from another country, then another. Nothing grand. "I went through this too. Call your sister in the morning. Eat something before bed. We are here." One reply contains a typo nobody fixes. Another arrives with a photograph of a half-eaten sandwich, proof that the person answering is awake, ordinary and really there. The problem remains, but the room feels different. She already knows who tends to answer at this hour, and who will see the message after sunrise. These relationships have rhythms, private jokes, old misunderstandings, people who remember what happened last winter. Distance does not make them imaginary. It does mean that tonight, none of them can knock on her door. For people who are geographically isolated, chronically ill, queer in an unwelcoming town, newly arrived in a country, or living with an experience few people nearby understand, an online group can become a central part of social life. It may offer knowledge and safety that the immediate neighbourhood cannot. Friendships begun in forums and group chats can last for years, move into phone calls and visits, or remain entirely online without becoming less important to the people inside them. What digital life changes is not whether closeness can exist, but the number of very different relationships that can appear beside one another. Hundreds of people may recognize a laugh, a face, a familiar way of telling a story. They may know one version of a person extremely well. The diagnosis never mentioned, the fight with a parent, the Tuesday that collapsed for reasons too complicated to post, those remain elsewhere. When someone goes quiet, a few people may notice immediately. For everyone else, the feed closes the gap before it has time to look like an absence. She starts typing a post late one evening, and the first sentence is honest enough that she would only ever say it to one particular friend. Then she remembers who else will see it. A co-worker follows this account. So does an aunt who tends to worry, and an old school friend who has no context for any of this, and strangers who will read whatever they read into it without knowing her at all. She rewrites the sentence, then rewrites it again. What finally gets posted is true, in a narrow sense, and safe enough that nobody in that scattered audience could take it the wrong way, which also means nobody who actually knew what the evening was like would recognize it from the description. Researchers sometimes call this context collapse, the flattening that happens when one message has to satisfy every possible reader at once, from a boss to a stranger to a childhood friend, with no way to address any of them separately. A wider audience does not automatically mean a more intimate one. Sometimes it produces the opposite, a version of a person smoothed down until it fits everyone, and therefore fits no one in particular. Digital contact also has strengths no physical gathering reproduces exactly. It can unfold asynchronously at 3 a.m. when a person needs somewhere to put a thought before a room becomes available to hear it. It can connect two people living through the same rare experience on opposite sides of a continent, who might otherwise never have found each other. A written message can be drafted, paused, revised and answered after the first rush of feeling has passed. That extra time sometimes makes room for something speech. Arriving too fast would never quite manage. The exchange can cross rooms, time zones and waking hours without asking both lives to become free at once. A similar intimacy can form around someone who never knows us in return. A podcast host's voice on the morning commute becomes familiar enough to soften an empty kitchen or a long drive. A listener can hear fatigue in a pause or recognize the story the host is about to tell. The host does not know that particular listener exists. The comfort is not fraudulent. It is simply carried by a relationship whose knowledge and obligations run mainly in one direction. Even the phone's smallest signals blur unlike forms of attention. A message may mean that a friend remembered something we said yesterday. A reaction may be a quick, affectionate touch. The next vibration may be a sale, an automated reminder, or a platform asking us to return. All of them arrive through the same glass with nearly the same sound. Small gestures still matter. The difficulty is that care, commerce, habit, and interruption have been given similar clothes. Reachability has another side. It is possible to contact someone from almost anywhere, and possible to withdraw without sharing a room, crossing a street, or explaining the silence face to face. This story has already touched that disappearance. Here it matters only as part of the contradiction. Access has become easier without making endings clearer. Shared culture did not vanish into personalized feeds, it changed shape. 4 people in one household may spend the evening inside unrelated streams of news and entertainment. Elsewhere, a fandom, game, forum, or group chat develops its own jokes, history, and language. Digital life can separate attention and gather it again, often at the same time. The desire to belong has also become something organizations can package. Paid groups, membership communities, brand cultures, and workplaces can create genuine friendship because the people inside them are genuine. The arrangement becomes more fragile when access depends on a subscription, or when a company borrows the language of family while keeping the right to end the relationship with a meeting and a disabled login. The crowd fits in a pocket. Friday evening still has to be spent somewhere. She wants to leave the house not for a special event, only to be near other lives for a while. The cafe closes soon. Sitting there for another hour would seem to require another order. The park feels different after dark. The community centre runs activities on weekday afternoons. Her friends live across a city that turns a casual visit into an expedition. The interesting thing happening tonight required a ticket and a decision several days ago. Places exist, but getting to them may require money, transport, free time, childcare, physical ease, or confidence in the journey home. The barrier is often a pile of ordinary conditions rather than one locked door. Ray Oldenburg used the term third place for settings outside home and work where people could spend time without a formal invitation. Cafes, barbershops, pubs, laundromats, local gathering rooms. Such places were never equally open. Many excluded people through law, custom, price, stares, harassment, or the quiet message that they were not the intended customer. What matters here is not a lost golden age. In many communities, low-cost places for unplanned presence have become uneven, commercial, or difficult to reach at the hours people are free. The shape of a neighbourhood can add its own friction. In a car-dependent area, a day may pass from front door to garage, from car to parking lot, and from parking lot to a building, then reverse at night. Hundreds of people pass nearby, but few remain in the same place long enough to become familiar. Cars also provide mobility, safety, and necessary access, particularly where distances are large or public transport is poor. The question is what kinds of contact a route makes likely, not whether one mode of travel is morally better than another. Then there is the cost of merely staying somewhere. A second coffee to justify the table, a shaded bench in one neighbourhood and nowhere to sit in the next, a public toilet locked before evening. These details sound minor until a person is old, disabled, short of money, caring for a child, or simply trying to remain outside the house without continually purchasing permission. Eric Linenberg calls libraries, parks, sidewalks, transit, and local institutions social infrastructure, the conditions that make repeated encounter possible. Infrastructure cannot manufacture friendship, but it can give friendship familiarity and casual company somewhere to happen. Telling an isolated person to try harder does not replace it. A distant friend may know her history, understand the difficult parts of her family, and answer at 2 a.m, A nearby street may still offer nowhere she can sit for an hour among familiar faces. Digital and physical forms of connection are not opponents, and neither cancels the need for the other. Visibility can spread almost without limit. Responsibility usually remains slower, smaller, and personal. One name in the contact list once belonged to the centre of her days. There was no betrayal and no final conversation. Messages became less frequent, then careful, then mostly birthday wishes and promises to meet soon. The friend is still reachable. What disappeared was the life in which reaching each other happened without first deciding to. They once knew the small, unimportant facts of each other's weeks, which co-worker was becoming unbearable, what a mother had said over dinner, whether a minor cold was getting better or worse. Often, they were the first call. Then one moved. Work grew heavier. A partner, a child, an illness, or several ordinary pressures occupied the space where the friendship used to live. Daily messages became weekly, then monthly. Most conversations ended with the promise that they would catch up properly soon. Nobody fought. The friendship simply stopped occurring inside either person's day. That does not mean it stopped mattering. Adult life recognizes some claims on time more readily than others. Work hours, childcare, a partner's needs, and household obligations are understood as fixed realities. Friendship is often placed in the softer category, something to postpone, cancel, and recover later. The earlier question was what it cost to reach another person. This one is about which relationships are allowed to make that claim in the first place. A familiar adulthood story still runs through many institutions and expectations. Education, work, a central romantic partnership, perhaps marriage and children. Many lives take other forms: single, child-free, queer, non-monogamous, organised around friends or extended family. Elizabeth Brake uses the term amatonormativity for the assumption that a committed romantic couple should stand at the centre of a complete adult life. Where that assumption is strong, singleness can look unfinished, and friendship can be treated as something serious adults are expected to outgrow. One partner can become lover, housemate, closest confidant, crisis contact, social planner, and the main witness to a life. Two people may love each other deeply and still tire under that concentration. A single relationship is being asked to perform the work of a wider social world. Some relationships receive more automatic institutional recognition than others, regardless of how much care they carry. A spouse or close legal relative is more likely to be recognized by default in emergency, leave, inheritance, housing, and decision-making systems. A friend may be recognized when deliberately designated, but that often requires paperwork, foresight, and rules that vary from one institution to the next. Someone who has spent a decade sitting through appointments, remembering medications and answering the 2 a.m. call can therefore be central in practice and peripheral on paper. Many bereavement policies still define eligible loss through fixed lists of family relationships, while forms asking for next of kin may leave little room for the friend who actually knows the answer. Marriage and family can carry this weight honestly. The gap lies between the care a relationship carries and the status institutions know how to recognize automatically. Single and child-free adults are often assigned the role of the flexible friend. Plans settle around school pickups, couple commitments, and family calendars, while their time is assumed to bend. A dinner is moved for the 3rd time and they answer, of course, no problem, because the constraints are not invented. Caring for a child or dependent relative can make spontaneity nearly impossible. The imbalance appears when one person's obligations are treated as immovable and another person's needs as optional. The flexible friend may travel farther, accept the inconvenient hour, and become the person asked to fill the empty seat. From the outside, they can look busy, independent, and socially rich while remaining unsure who would make room for them in an emergency. That flexibility may be partly imaginary. She may also be caring for an aging parent, managing a chronic condition, working late, or protecting the one evening she needs alone before another demanding week. These claims are less visible because they are not written into a school calendar or attached to a spouse's schedule. They can therefore be treated as movable, even by people who care about her. Over time, she becomes practiced at saying that any place is fine and any hour works. The pattern does not prove that her friends value her less. It shows how easily one person's time becomes the spare material used to make everyone else's commitments fit. Friendships also thin for reasons no institution could prevent. A move, a new job, illness, political distance, a baby, or years of small disappointments can change what two people are able or willing to offer. Some friendships become manipulative, draining, or one-sided. Ending them can be an act of health rather than a failure of loyalty. The quieter losses are harder to name. A romantic breakup is culturally legible. There are songs for it. Familiar questions. Permission to grieve. A friendship can end without a recognized event. No one asks when the breakup happened. The grieving person may even reduce the loss for everyone else. It was only a friend. Friendship loss is often discussed through the idea of disenfranchised grief, sorrow that receives little public recognition and few accepted rituals. Years later, she learns from a social media post that the old friend is getting married. Once she would have heard before the announcement and probably helped choose something small and unnecessary, perhaps the flowers or the music for the entrance. Now the news reaches her with everyone else. She zooms in on the photograph without quite knowing why, notices a bracelet she recognizes, then closes the post. She's not angry. For a moment, she only feels the exact outline of what has changed. She saw the news, but she was no longer inside the relationship that carried it. Friendship is not maintained by affection alone. It needs time, repair, patience, boundaries, and repeated contact. Earlier in life, schools, shared workplaces, nearby homes, and habitual routes often provided that contact without anyone arranging it. Once those settings disappear, goodwill has to do work that routine once did. Some friendships survive distance and long silence beautifully. Others become vulnerable when every meeting requires a fresh negotiation. Technical reachability can make the drift more embarrassing. A message sits unanswered for a week. By the time there is space to reply, the delay itself seems to need an explanation, so the answer waits another day. One friend types a cheerful response in the supermarket queue, decides it sounds too casual after so long, and deletes it. Two people who can contact each other at any moment can spend months waiting for a better moment. Marriage and partnership can hold devotion, intimacy, friendship, and a shared life. Strain appears when one bond is expected to function as an entire social world. A partner cannot be every friend, witness, companion, and community a person will ever need. Friendship cannot replace every form of family or romantic care either. The two old friends may still love each other. What faded were the ordinary reasons they used to find themselves together again. The walk home, the habitual call, the evening neither of them had to arrange. Once one would arrive with groceries and stay through dinner without asking whether the week had room for it. Later, every visit needed a date, a journey, and enough energy left at the end of the day. The feeling remained after the structure around it disappeared. The care may still be there. What it lacks is a place and a rhythm sturdy enough to keep happening. By 7 on Thursday, a few people begin arriving at the same table. Nothing about the evening is staged. Someone arrives 15 minutes late, apologising about traffic. Someone else brings only a loaf of bread, and nobody comments on the difference. The soup is a little too salty. A child crawls under the table looking for a dropped toy and comes back with somebody else's sock. One regular barely speaks. He has had a hard week, and nobody pushes him to explain. A chair sits empty some weeks. Nobody runs an icebreaker. People clear the plates and come back the following Thursday. The table was not this comfortable in its first few months. Early on, a newcomer arrived carrying flowers, unsure whether wine or dessert or nothing at all was expected, and spent the evening slightly too aware of the mismatch. One regular talked more than anyone wanted, filling every pause before it had a chance to become comfortable. One week there was too much food, another week not nearly enough, and two people quietly went without seconds so a third wouldn't notice. Someone was late 3 weeks running, and a fourth person, tired of always being the one preparing to leave a door unlocked, said something a little sharper than they meant to. It landed badly. Two people didn't speak exactly for a couple of weeks afterward. Not a rupture, just a coolness that took its own time to thaw. The following Thursday still happened. Months later the table looked different, though nothing about it had been announced or decided. The spare key had found a particular hook by the door, and everyone reached for it without discussing why. Someone remembered, without being told twice, that one of the regulars could not eat shellfish. The quiet one no longer had to explain his silence. The others had learned not to treat it as a problem to solve. They knew who needed to leave by 9 for an early shift and stopped starting new conversations at 8:45. Nobody had designed these habits. They accumulated, the way a path across a lawn appears through repeated walking rather than from a plan. It wasn't perfect, even then. One evening, someone finally said what a few people had been noticing. The same two people had been buying the food and doing the dishes for months, while everyone else arrived empty-handed. Nobody stormed off. The complaint landed awkwardly, and the following weeks looked different. Someone else brought bread, someone else stayed to clean, and the shared key stopped living in only one pocket. The table continued because the work moved before it broke the people carrying it. The adjustment did not need a constitution. It needed the complaint to be heard and the labour to become visible. A table like this is never finished. Every few months its habits must be repaired by whoever notices what has begun to tilt. The table draws from different corners of a life. An old friend, a neighbour from 2 doors down, a cousin, someone who moved to the city 8 months ago and hasn't quite left since, a person who lives alone and one who's raising 2 kids on her own. Not everyone at that table is anyone else's closest friend. What the table does is turn a handful of them into people who are expected, at a particular hour in a particular place. An invitation to come by whenever is warm and vague. It leaves a person renegotiating every time, whether tonight is the night to show up, whether they will be intruding, whether they need an excuse. We eat here every Thursday at 7 carries less romance and considerably more weight. Nobody has to ask to be included or invite themselves. The routine absorbs the small test of nerve a one-off gathering tends to require. A shared table does not maintain itself. Someone sends the reminder, shows up on a tired night, and makes sure next Thursday actually occurs. Other recurring shapes can hold a bond in place. A monthly walk, a standing choir practice, whatever suits the person who dreads a table of 8 but might manage a walk with one companion. Some bonds do not depend on conversation at all. 2 adults picking up a child from school each week, or setting a table side by side, may grow close without ever sitting down to discuss the friendship. Months can pass before they know much about each other's lives, and then, gradually, they do. Friendship is often imagined as something built through disclosure and shared feeling, but closeness sometimes follows the task rather than preceding it. Shared work does not guarantee intimacy. Unpaid, unequal, or coerced labour can exhaust people instead. Reciprocity and choice matter. Contribution may be no larger than opening the door or remembering a newcomer's name. There is a common suspicion that a friendship kept alive by a calendar entry is less authentic than one that happens on its own. Often, the opposite is true. People protect a recurring bond because they have learned what happens to relationships left to memory and spare time. Writing a friend into the month does not mean the feeling is thinned. It can mean, this time is yours, not I will see you if nothing better comes up. Saying that plainly can feel riskier than it sounds. We should do this more often. Could we make this a regular thing? I do not need advice. I just do not want to be alone tonight. Can I come with you next time? I could use some help. The pause before one of these sentences is often longer than the sentence itself. Asking is not safe for everyone. Some have been mocked or quietly indebted for it before, and that history does not disappear because a new table looks friendlier. At that table, one person may carry the shared key while another picks up groceries for a neighbour who cannot get out. Nobody's worth should be measured by tasks like these. Yet limited mutual responsibility can turn affection into a habit that survives the weeks when feeling alone is not enough to organise a life. A structure like this can curdle. The table can start watching its members, or lean on the same 2 or 3 people to do all the caring. A workable version needs an exit built into it, the freedom to miss a week without an inquisition, or leave if the group begins to cost more than it gives. A person may be absent for 6 weeks, for reasons nobody else needs to know, and still find a seat waiting on their return. The response to an empty chair is a brief message, with room to answer or not. Being expected is not the same as being owned. Reaching that table most weeks depends on more than affection. A parent who wants to arrive by 7 may need to collect a child, split the pickup with a partner who is equally stretched, begin dinner at home, and find cover for the final hour of a shift that should have ended earlier. None of those logistics measures how much she cares about the people waiting. Predictable hours, reliable childcare, transport, stable housing, and a nearby community space cannot create a relationship. They can make Thursday night possible. A scattered social life is not evidence of a damaged character. A move, grief, illness, caregiving, retirement, or simply growing older in a neighbourhood where everyone else has left, can loosen the social shape of a life for a season or much longer. A shared key, an answered group chat, a coat already slung over the back of a chair. These are modest signs that other people have become part of the week. Not every old bond needs repairing. Some friendships have run their course, and leaving them in the past can be healthy. What comes next may be a repaired friendship, a new recurring habit, a boundary reset with family, or one loose thread drawn a little closer. Some week, one of the chairs will sit empty. A phone comes out. Not a long message. Just, missed you tonight. No pressure, just checking in. The reply may arrive in the morning or not at all. The chair will still be there the following week. A place can expect someone without keeping them under watch. The chair remains an invitation, not a claim on the person who usually fills it. The city is still there at the end of the story. Lit windows, late traffic, a train carrying a few people through the dark. Behind one window, someone scrolls through names and cannot decide whom to call. Behind another, a table has already been set for Thursday. Elsewhere, a phone lights up with a brief message. Missed you tonight. No pressure, just checking in. Neither scene arrived through a grand transformation. They were built through repetition, with missed weeks and awkward repairs included. A weekly table and an answered group chat do not cure loneliness. They give it somewhere less empty to occur, and a direction in which to move. Late, in one of those rooms, someone looks at their phone again. Instead of scrolling past hundreds of names, they write to one particular person. Or they write nothing, and remember that a chair has their name on it 3 days from now. Whether they arrive in a good mood or a bad one, the reply may not come tonight. The light may still be switched off in a quiet room. Elsewhere, someone leaves a chair open for next Thursday.